On January 5, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, Michael King Jr. was born. Later changing his name to Martin Luther King Jr., he would go on to become one of the most influential civil rights activists in history before his untimely death by assassination at the age of 39 on April 4, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee. These are 5 of his greatest achievements. List of 5. Nobel Peace Prize. On October 14, 1964, at the age of 35, King became the youngest person in history to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in the resistance against racial inequality through nonviolent means. He accepted the award in Oslo, Norway, on December 10th of that same year. King, who was heavily influenced by Mohandas Gandhi, hailed Gandhi during his acceptance speech for setting the successful precedent for nonviolent activism. During his speech, he also questioned why the civil rights movement received the award, when it had not yet won the peace and brotherhood which is the essence of the Nobel Prize. Later stating that he believed the award was granted in recognition, that nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral question of our time. The need for man to overcome oppression and violence without resorting to violence and oppression. King concluded his acceptance speech with the following: I think Alfred Nobel would know what I mean when I say that I accept this award in the spirit of a curator of some precious heirloom which he holds in trust for its true owners, all those to whom beauty is truth and truth beauty, and in whose eyes the beauty of genuine brotherhood and peace is more precious than diamonds or silver or gold. After being awarded just over $54,000 in prize money, King donated it to the civil rights movement. The Birmingham Campaign. In early 1963, in Birmingham, Alabama, arguably one of the most racially segregated cities in America at the time, a campaign of protests against racial segregation and for equal rights began. Led by Martin Luther King Jr., this campaign would span just over 5 weeks and become one of the most pivotal events of the 1960s civil rights movement. King, recovering from the damage to his reputation by the disappointing results of a similar campaign that he had recently led in Albany, Georgia, decided that a change in strategy was needed when it came time to organize a new campaign in Birmingham. Part of the revised strategy was to focus on a more narrow set of goals confined to specific areas of the city, rather than the city as a whole, as they had done in Albany. The goals of this campaign would be the desegregation of Birmingham's downtown stores, fair hiring practices in shops and city employment, the reopening of public parks, and the creation of a biracial committee to oversee the desegregation of Birmingham's public schools. The philosophy behind the Birmingham campaign was best summarized by King when he said, "The purpose of direct action is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation." In keeping with King's nonviolent approach to activism, the Birmingham campaign utilized many nonviolent methods of confrontation. These included sit-ins at libraries and lunch counters, kneel-ins at white churches, and a march to the county building to mark the beginning of a voter registration drive. The majority of businesses refused to serve demonstrators. Some of the participants were spat on by white spectators, and hundreds of protesters ended up being arrested, which was actually one of the goals of the campaign. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, thought that by filling the jails, the city would be forced to negotiate as demonstrations continued. But, in the end, not enough people were arrested to affect the functioning of the city. King himself would eventually be arrested and put in jail on Good Friday, April 12, 1963. He was among 50 Birmingham residents ranging in age from 15 to 81 who were arrested that day. This was King's 13th arrest. Due to pressure from business owners whose chain stores' profits were being negatively affected by the protests, the Kennedy administration intervened, and Martin Luther King was released from jail on April 20th. SCLC organizer James Bevel eventually convinced the reluctant King that the utilization of children would be necessary, so Bevel devised a controversial plan called Children's Crusade to recruit students into the campaign efforts. This plan called for students from Birmingham elementary schools, high schools, and even a nearby college to take part in demonstrations. On May 3rd, Birmingham's Commissioner of Public Safety at the time, Eugene Bull Connor, realizing that the Birmingham jail was at capacity, decided that a change of tactics was needed to quell the demonstrations. Around 1,000 students had gathered at a church preparing to march across the Kelly Ingram Park. Upon leaving the church to begin their march, they were confronted by police warning them to turn back or you'll get wet. When students continued marching, Connor ordered the city's fire hoses be turned on them. With enough force to peel bark off of trees, many of the students were knocked over and rolled down the street and along walls by the hoses. Connor, allowing white spectators to push forward, shouted, "Let those people come forward, Sergeant. I want them to see the dogs work." Black parents and adults who were observing and cheering the marching students began to throw rocks and bottles at the police after they had turned the fire hoses on the children. To disperse them, Connor ordered that police dogs be used to keep them in line, as James Bevel ran through the crowds warning them, "If any cops get hurt, we're going to lose this fight." Birmingham's fire department refused orders from Connor to turn the hoses on the demonstrators again, and waded through the basement of the 16th Street Baptist Church to clean up water from earlier fire hose flooding. The protest ended at 3 p.m. as protesters went home and police removed the barricades and reopened the streets to traffic. King told worried parents in a crowd of thousands that evening, "Don't worry about your children who are in jail. The eyes of the world are on Birmingham. We're going on in spite of dogs and fire hoses. We've gone too far to turn back." By May 6th, the jails were so full that Connor transformed the stockade at the state fairgrounds into a makeshift jail to hold protesters. Urged by Kennedy, the United Auto Workers, National Maritime Union, United Steelworkers Union, and the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations raised $237,000 in bail money, equivalent to $1.8 million today, to free the demonstrators. On May 10th, ACMHR member Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and Martin Luther King Jr. told reporters that they had reached an agreement with the city of Birmingham to desegregate lunch counters, restrooms, drinking fountains, and fitting rooms within 90 days, and to hire blacks in stores as salesmen and clerks. Those in jail will be released on bond or their own recognizance. Commissioner Connor and the outgoing mayor condemned the resolution. Birmingham's public schools were integrated in September 1963. The Great March on Washington. In 1963, in the wake of violent attacks on civil rights demonstrators in Birmingham, Alabama, momentum built for another mass protest on the nation's capital. The March on Washington took place on August 1963 and was a massive protest march in which 250,000 people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. The goal of the event was to draw attention to continuing challenges and inequalities faced by African Americans a century after the emancipation. It was on this occasion that Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his now iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. King spoke last at the March on Washington when it stopped at the Lincoln Memorial. He spoke following a song by gospel star Mahalia Jackson, who urged him to tell the crowd about his dream. He began reading from his notes, but towards the end of his speech, he departed from what he had written. King then launched into the most famous part of his speech, building toward its dramatic ending as he said, "And so, even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. And when this happens, we will be able to speed up that day when all God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old spiritual, 'Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.'" Following the Birmingham campaign and the Great March on Washington, the Civil Rights Act bill, drawn up by the Kennedy administration and signed by President Lyndon Johnson, was passed into law in 1964. The Civil Rights Act applied to the entire nation, prohibiting racial discrimination in employment and in access to public places. Nonviolent protesting. One of Martin Luther King Jr.'s biggest contributions to the civil rights movement was being an advocate of nonviolent protesting. During the civil rights movement, King led 8 nonviolent protests. He believed that nonviolent protest is the most effective weapon against racism and injustice in society. The first protest led by King was the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, a campaign against racial segregation on public transit. It resulted in King's house being firebombed and a federal court ruling that the laws in both Alabama and Montgomery requiring segregated buses were unconstitutional. The second was the Albany movement in 1961. A coalition was formed in Albany, Georgia, to protest the city's segregation policies. King joined the coalition and was jailed in a mass arrest of peaceful demonstrators and declined bail until the racist policies were changed. The Albany movement became the testing ground for various nonviolent tactics used in future protests. The third and fourth were 1963's Birmingham Campaign and the March on Washington, both covered in number 2 and 3 on this list. The fifth was Bloody Sunday, which took place in 1965. King was not present, but days before he had met with government officials to gain assurance that the marchers would not be impeded. However, mob and police violence caused the march to be aborted on that Bloody Sunday. Police brutality was broadcast on TVs around the country, sparking public outrage and helping to boost support for the civil rights movement. This was a turning point for the civil rights movement, clearly demonstrating King's strategy of nonviolence. The sixth occurred in Chicago in 1966. Chosen to shine a light on segregation and black urban problems, King led hundreds of people on a march into the white enclave of Marquette Park in Chicago's southwest side to protest housing segregation. Thousands of white people gathered and taunted the protesters. They threw bottles, rocks, and firecrackers, resulting in 30 people, including King, being injured. Later, King said, "I have seen many demonstrations in the South, but I have never seen anything so hostile and hateful as I have seen here today." He continued, "I have to do this to expose myself, to bring this hate into the open." The seventh was an anti-Vietnam War protest in 1967. King denounced America's involvement in the war on many occasions. In one speech, he criticized the U.S. government, commenting on the cruel irony of black Americans dying for a country that treated them like second-class citizens. This opposition to the war cost him many white allies and gained him many enemies, including President Lyndon Johnson and members of the media. King called it one of history's most cruel and senseless wars. The eighth was King's Poor People's Campaign in 1968, which addressed the issues of economic justice and housing for the poor. King and the SCLC organized people around the country to march on Washington until Congress passed a Bill of Rights for poor Americans. Joined by DC's poor and homeless, SCLC members continued the campaign after King's assassination in April 1968. In the summer of that year, the protesters effectively shut down the city. However, the Bill of Rights and Vision never became law. Since the Emancipation Proclamation, not a single civil rights act had been passed, and discrimination ran rampant throughout the country. Then, because of rising racial tensions and protests by blacks, President John F. Kennedy proposed by far the most comprehensive civil rights legislation to date, saying the United States will not fully be free until all of its citizens are free. After Kennedy was assassinated, President Lyndon B. Johnson took up the cause. King said that it was nothing less than a second emancipation. Basic civil rights for African Americans. Martin Luther King Jr.'s greatest achievement and the fruit of his labor was being instrumental in earning basic civil rights for African American citizens of the United States of America. Lasting from around 1955 to 1968, the African American Civil Rights Movement, which had the goal of abolishing racial discrimination, was led by King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, which was formed in 1957. King himself was instrumental in the formation of the SCLC, a civil rights organization that supported the philosophy of nonviolence. He and his supporters used strategies like boycotts, sit-ins, and protest marches. When attacked by racists and police, the activists refused to fight back. The civil rights movement was very successful. It helped get 5 federal laws and 2 amendments to the Constitution passed, officially protecting the rights of African Americans. It also helped to change the attitudes of many white people about the ways in which black people were treated and the rights they deserved. Among the rights that became law as a direct result of the leadership of King were changes to voter registration, the integration of public schools, and the all-important Civil Rights Act of 1964, which said it was illegal to discriminate against people in public places or jobs just because of their race, skin color, religion, gender, or home country, and made illegal any state or local laws that made these things legal. Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law on August 6, 1965. This law made it illegal to stop somebody from voting because of their race. This meant that all the state laws that kept black people from voting were now illegal. In 1966, activists, including Martin Luther King Jr., led a movement for fair housing in Chicago. The next year, members of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, did the same in Milwaukee. In both cities, activists were physically attacked by white homeowners and legally attacked by politicians who supported segregation. Finally, on April 10th, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Part of the law is called the Fair Housing Act, which makes it illegal to discriminate in selling, renting, or lending money for housing based on a person's race, skin color, religion, or home country. These have been 5 of Martin Luther King Jr.'s greatest achievements.